Here is Sailor Manyo Kakitsubata, a blue ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. This is a lighter blue than I had expected looking at the swatch, and swatches lie. There is some tone variation as the paper changes, and it generally comes with some light shading. It is also generally well behaved, and on non-fountain pen friendly paper, it stays well behaved and is generally serviceable. Like many blue inks, this suffers the competitive pool. I don't know if this becomes a go-to with so many blues to choose from. That said, if given a bottle, I wouldn't hesitate to use it, but I don't think I will be buying a bottle. The pen for today is a Franklin Christoph Model 66 with a music nib. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. We get a very interesting tone of blue here on the Clairfontaine that doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. We do get to see some shading that frequently occurs towards the end of words, like the I in Feely and the I in Keely on the second line, the D and between them, the dots of the I's, the exclamation point. But we don't get it very often in the middle of words, though it does happen when you look at, say, the O of memory on the third line. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer. Here is Sailor Clown Green Yellow Pigment. Here is Sailor Dancer Pink. Here is Sailor Fire Red. Here is Sailor Lion Light Brown. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Here the tone is slightly muted as it was compared to the Clairfontaine, though it's very much similar. It's very close. It's just a little muted. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. There still is shading, but on the first line, the end of the U into the T does get darker. It's just not huge and stand out. We do get to see it show up a little bit more frequently in the middle of words, like there on the second line, where the H gets a bit darker than the letters around it, but same with that R at the end, where throat's right next to that, the H is darker than most of the letters of the word, where the S at the end, again, gets darker. Not a ton of shading here. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting, continuing the good story. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. The tone we get here is almost the same as we had on the Clairfontaine. And I say almost because there is a very slight variation to the tone. Not darker or lighter, but a variation in the blue, showing that this ink is a little bit translucent, letting the color of the page really alter this a little bit. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it shades about like it did on the Clairfontaine. Being the last letter of words is where you're usually going to find that darker spot. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. Here we have the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it shades just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. It does stand out against the quad rule without any kind of a problem. And the lines on the paper are not cutting the ink, something that for me is visually distracting. So the fact that it doesn't do it is a very good thing. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Parker Quink Washable Blue. Here is Pelikan 4001 Royal Blue. Here is Pen BBS number 182 April Diamond. Here is Private Reserve Black Magic Blue. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. The tone here is certainly lighter and more muted, flatter than the already general flat tone that we had. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it shades much less than it did on the Clairfontaine, though you can find a couple of areas that it does do it. If you look at it on the second line, the I is lighter than the T. Host on the first line, the hose is lighter than the T that gets much darker. Really, there's only a few darker letters to be found. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page. Here is Diamine Pink Glitz. Here is Califolio Aurora. Here is Colorverse Einstein Ring. Here is Sailor Studio number 670. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. The tone we're getting here is just a little bit lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. There is some very light feathering going on very regularly here. I don't think for most it would really be a problem. There is a little bit of spread, but the feathering and the spread on this paper are really to be expected. Now, with that, there are a couple of moments of shading that do happen. You do get to see a darker letter here and there, but very little, almost no shading at all. I think this is a passable situation on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, we see that it gets fairly deep into the paper very regularly, never bled through touching the page underneath, but I don't think you could write back here because of how deep it gets in. Although I wouldn't really call this ghosting, I would just say you couldn't use it. So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The Franklin Christoph Model 66 has a good medium flow, broad nib and gives good tone and shading. Off camera, I tried it in a wet medium to see if it darkened, and it did, and it's still shaded. There, it much more fit a blue I would go for, so the darker, more vivid blue with light shading from a wet medium makes me think a wet pen in fine or medium is the way to go. But I think even in a wet broad or stub, it may revert back to the tone we saw in the writing sample. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.